The mountain man's gaze softened, though he remained silent, sensing the vulnerability in her words. Finally, she spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart for so long, words that seemed to hang in the air like smoke from the fire. "I am not worth much," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. Sometimes I feel I can only be useful to others, and that's the only reason I exist." She paused, staring into the flames, as though searching for an answer from the fire itself. The mountain man did not respond immediately. He could feel the truth of her words, but he also saw the danger in them, the danger of believing that one's worth is only in what they give, not in who they are. He thought of his own life, of the years he had spent alone, and of the lessons the mountains had taught him. He understood solitude, hardship, and the sense of being unnoticed, but he also knew that life's value was not measured only by service or survival. "Life isn't only about what you give," he said finally, his voice steady and firm. "It's about who you are, even when no one notices. You matter because you exist, not because of what you do." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who had lived through isolation and hardship and had discovered the quiet truth of life. Every person has value, even if the world doesn't always show it. Sister Maria listened, absorbing his words. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of hope, a sense that perhaps her worth was not tied solely to her service or to the approval of others. The firelight reflected in her eyes, and she allowed herself a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness and relief. She realized that she had spent much of her life hiding from her own feelings, denying her own needs, and believing that she was invisible. Tonight, with the mountain man listening, she felt seen. The conversation shifted after that. They began to share stories of their lives in a more light-hearted way, remembering small joys and victories that had been overshadowed by hardship. The mountain man told her about a time he had rescued a trapped fawn from the snow, and she laughed softly at his description of how he had stumbled through the forest, struggling to carry it back to safety. In turn, she told him about the children in her care at the convent, the small acts of kindness that had made a difference in someone's life. Though their experiences were very different, they found common ground in the human desire to matter, to be understood, and to connect. As the night deepened, the storm began to calm. The wind died down, and the heavy rain softened to a steady patter on the roof. Outside, the mountains were dark and silent, but inside the cabin, a new warmth had taken root, one that came not from the fire alone, but from the quiet bond forming between two lonely souls. Sister Maria leaned back against the wall, feeling the soft weight of relief that came from speaking truths aloud. She realized that in admitting her doubts and fears, she had not weakened herself. She had begun to reclaim a sense of identity and self-worth she had almost forgotten. The mountain man, watching her quietly, felt a similar transformation. He had lived for years in isolation, and he had become accustomed to his own company. But tonight had reminded him that human connection was not a weakness, but a necessity. Even the strongest among us needs someone to listen, someone to understand, and someone to share the warmth of life with, especially during the coldest and darkest nights. By the time dawn approached, the storm had passed entirely. A soft light filtered through the small windows of the cabin, illuminating the worn walls and the simple furnishings. Sister Maria stretched, feeling a sense of renewal, though she knew that her life would continue to be challenging. The mountain man prepared a small breakfast, and they ate together in companionable silence, each carrying the lessons of the night in their hearts. Neither spoke of the words she had shared again, but both understood their significance. It had been a night of confession, of honesty, and of the quiet realization that even the loneliest hearts could find connection and understanding. As Sister Maria prepared to leave the cabin and continue her journey, she felt a renewed sense of courage. And as the mountain man watched her disappear down the mountain trail, he felt a quiet gratitude for having witnessed a human soul brave enough to speak its truth, even in the harshest of circumstances. It was a night that would stay with them both forever, a night when two lives, isolated in very different ways, had intersected and reminded each other of the value of existence, of honesty, and of the warmth that comes from understanding another human being. Neither would forget the lessons learned by the fire, and both carried them forward into lives that, while separate, had been subtly changed by a single, unforgettable evening. The morning after the storm brought a quiet calm to the mountains. The sun rose slowly, spilling golden light across the slopes and turning the mist into soft streams of color. The mountain man moved about his cabin with ease, performing the small tasks that had become second nature over the years. He chopped wood for the fire, refilled his water container from the nearby stream, and repaired the small roof leak that the storm had exposed. Each task was familiar, each movement precise, but his thoughts were not on survival today. They were on the woman he had hosted the night before. He had never spoken of loneliness. Not really. He had learned to live with it, to accept it as part of his life in the mountains. Yet something about Sister Maria's presence lingered in his mind. Her honesty, her vulnerability, and her willingness to share her fears had unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. He realized that he had been living in a world where people were either passing strangers or necessary connections for survival, and no one had ever asked him to consider the value of simply existing. As he fed the fire, he thought about the words she had spoken. "I am not worth much." They echoed in his mind, stirring memories he had long buried. He remembered his father, a man who had taught him survival but rarely praised him, and his mother, who had loved him but had been weighed down by her own struggles. He remembered friends he had lost through disagreements or distance, and the times he had pushed people away because he feared they would leave him anyway. He realized that, like Sister Maria, he had also measured his worth through what he could do or provide, rather than simply who he was. The mountain man spent the morning in quiet reflection, moving through his cabin in a deliberate, almost meditative rhythm. He didn't speak to anyone, of course. There was no one else to speak to. But he felt the need to process what had happened during the storm. Sister Maria had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten: the importance of connection, the need for understanding, and the truth that human worth was not tied to achievement or endurance alone. Later in the day, he decided to walk along one of the mountain paths he had cleared years ago. The air was crisp and the birds sang above him, filling the silence that was usually his only companion. As he walked, he replayed the conversations from the night before in his mind. He thought about the small gestures, the way she had wrapped her blanket tightly, the careful way she had moved around the cabin, the way her eyes had lingered on the fire. He realized that these details mattered, not because they were grand or dramatic, but because they revealed a human being who, like him, had carried a quiet struggle. He paused at a small clearing overlooking the valley below. The river snaked through the forest, glinting in the sunlight, and the village in the distance seemed peaceful and distant at the same time. He leaned on his walking stick, lost in thought. He wondered what it would be like if people truly recognized their own worth, if they understood that value was inherent and not earned through constant sacrifice or struggle. Sister Maria's words had ignited a reflection he hadn't anticipated, a subtle challenge to his long-held belief that solitude was the only true way to survive. Returning to his cabin, he found that the quiet had given him a sense of clarity. He began to consider how he could engage with Sister Maria again, not out of obligation, but because he had seen how powerful honesty could be when shared. He thought about the lessons he might impart, not as a teacher, but as someone who had learned from life in isolation, the importance of resilience, the necessity of caring for oneself, and the simple fact that each life had value beyond tasks and achievements. That evening, when Sister Maria returned to the cabin after gathering supplies from the village, the mountain man was ready to speak more openly. She greeted him with her usual quiet smile, and he noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor. She moved with more confidence now, her eyes carrying a quiet determination instead of the self-doubt that had shadowed them before. He offered her tea and bread, simple fare, but she accepted gratefully, appreciating the thoughtfulness behind the gesture. They sat by the fire, the warmth filling the small room as shadows danced on the walls. The mountain man began to speak, cautiously, as though testing the waters of a conversation that could be delicate. "Last night," he said, "you said something that stayed with me, about not being worth much. I've thought about it all day." He paused, looking at the fire before meeting her eyes. "I think you're wrong. Your worth isn't measured by what you give or how others see you. It's part of who you are. You can be kind, helpful, and thoughtful, but you are still valuable even when no one notices." Sister Maria listened silently, letting his words sink in. There was a stillness in the room, a pause in which the wind outside seemed to quiet as if to honor the moment. She realized that he wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to himself as well, reflecting the lessons he had learned from a life spent alone. In that quiet, she felt a bond forming, subtle yet undeniable. Two people, each shaped by solitude and struggle, were finding common ground in the understanding of something deeper than daily survival. They spoke for hours, sharing stories of their lives and reflecting on the choices that had led them to this moment. The mountain man told her about his earliest years in the mountains, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. He spoke about the time he had lost a friend to an accident in the forest, and how it had changed the way he approached life. Sister Maria shared more about the convent, her hopes and fears, and the small moments of joy that reminded her why she had chosen a life of service. Throughout the evening, their conversation moved between light-hearted moments and deeper reflection. They laughed quietly at memories and misadventures, and they grew silent when the weight of their own experiences pressed upon them. Each pause, each shared glance, carried the understanding that they were not alone in their struggles. For the first time in a long while, the mountain man felt that someone truly listened, someone whose presence mattered beyond the practical necessities of life. By the time night fell, a sense of calm had settled over the cabin. The fire burned low, casting a soft glow on the walls, and outside, the mountains were bathed in moonlight. Sister Maria wrapped her blanket around her shoulders, and the mountain man poured another small cup of tea for her. Neither spoke immediately. Words were not needed to acknowledge the bond that had formed. As they sat together, the mountain man reflected on the unusual path that had led them here. He realized that life in isolation had taught him much about survival, but it had not prepared him for the lessons of companionship and empathy. He understood now that true strength was not in enduring alone, but in being willing to see and be seen, to share and to accept. He had been given a rare gift, the presence of someone who could mirror his own reflections and challenge him to think beyond the boundaries of solitude. Sister Maria, too, felt a quiet transformation. She understood that her worth was not a measure of her service alone, and that her life could carry meaning beyond the expectations of others. In the mountain man, she saw someone who had endured hardships without complaint, who had faced life's challenges with courage, and who could, in his quiet way, teach her about resilience, integrity, and the value of simply existing. As sleep approached, they prepared their small beds in the cabin, each carrying the weight of the day's reflection, and the warmth of the connection that had formed. The mountain man lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the conversations, the laughter, and the moments of silence that had carried more meaning than words could express. He felt a quiet gratitude, a sense that even in a life of solitude, moments like this could illuminate the heart in ways that survival alone never could. Sister Maria, lying across from him, felt a similar sense of peace. She understood that the mountains were no longer just a place of trial, but a place of learning and reflection. The mountain man had shown her, without judgment or expectation, that life could hold value simply in existence, and that connection, even fleeting, could change the way one saw themselves. That night, the cabin held more than shelter. It held understanding, reflection, and the beginnings of a bond that neither of them had anticipated.
Whoa!
Both realized that they had learned from each other, that the presence of another person could challenge beliefs, heal old wounds, and offer a quiet hope that life, even in isolation, could carry warmth beyond the fire. The days that followed the storm were bright and clear, yet a quiet unease lingered over Sister Maria. She had returned to the convent after her brief stay at the mountain man's cabin, but her mind remained on the mountains, on the firelight, and on the man who had listened to her without judgment. The convent, once familiar and comforting, now felt rigid and confining. The rules that had once guided her, the rituals that had given her purpose, now seemed heavy and distant. For the first time in years, she began to question what she truly wanted, not what others expected of her, but what she herself needed. She walked the convent gardens in the early mornings, the dew soaking her shoes and the air sharp with the scent of earth and flowers. She spoke with her fellow sisters, but her words felt hollow. She smiled, nodded, and performed her duties. Yet a quiet unrest hummed in her chest. Each act of service reminded her of the night at the cabin, of the conversations by the fire, and of the mountain man's words. Your worth isn't measured by what you give. She could not stop thinking about them, and with each thought, the seeds of doubt about her life's path grew stronger. One afternoon, while tending to the garden, Sister Maria felt an overwhelming sense of confusion. She had dedicated her life to helping others, yet she realized she had never truly considered her own happiness or needs. She remembered the nights in the convent when she had prayed for guidance, and she realized that her prayers had been for strength to serve others, never for herself. She had been living a life of obedience and sacrifice, believing that this was the only way to be valuable, yet she felt empty inside. The feeling of emptiness grew until one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she decided to return to the mountains. She needed clarity, a chance to see the world through fresh eyes, and perhaps to understand her own heart away from the expectations of the convent. She packed lightly, carrying only the essentials, and set out along the winding path toward the cabin that had become more than a shelter in a storm. It had become a place of reflection, a place where her mind and heart could breathe. When she arrived, the mountain man greeted her quietly, without surprise. He had expected her return, sensing that she would need the mountains and the quiet as much as the warmth of the cabin. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and hesitation. "I needed to come back," she admitted softly, her voice carrying the weight of weeks of inner struggle. "I needed to think, to be, free for a while, without rules telling me who I should be." He nodded, understanding without comment. They settled near the fire, and for a long moment neither spoke. The wind outside was gentle, rustling the trees instead of shaking them as before. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with warmth and light. Sister Maria's thoughts turned inward, and she began to speak of her doubts, fears, and questions about her path. "I've always believed that serving others was the only way to matter," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "I thought if I gave everything, then my life had value. But now I don't know. I feel like I've forgotten what it means to live for myself." Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to speak steadily. "I don't know if I can go back to the convent and live the same way. I'm scared of disappointing everyone, even myself." The mountain man listened quietly, his hands folded across his knees. He had spent years alone, facing challenges that required strength and endurance, but he recognized a different kind of challenge in her words. The challenge of facing oneself honestly. He wanted to offer guidance, but he knew the answers could not be given. They had to be discovered. Instead, he shared stories of his own life, of struggles he had faced in isolation, and of mistakes he had made. "I've spent years surviving," he said, "but surviving isn't living. I've built walls around myself because I thought it was safer, but sometimes the walls keep out the warmth too. You need to find what makes your heart feel alive. Only then will you know your true worth." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of experience and quiet wisdom. Sister Maria considered them carefully. She realized that she had been living in a world where duty and obedience had overshadowed her own desires. She had believed that selflessness was the highest form of goodness, yet now she saw that neglecting her own needs had left her heart heavy and her spirit tired. The mountain man's words were a mirror, reflecting the truth she had avoided. Life was not only about sacrifice, it was about balance, about knowing oneself and being willing to take steps toward fulfillment. The next days were filled with quiet reflection and small tasks around the cabin. Sister Maria helped gather firewood, prepare meals, and fetch water from the stream. The mountain man worked alongside her, offering guidance when needed, but allowing her to find her own rhythm. The work was simple, but it became a meditation. With each task, she felt a sense of accomplishment, a feeling of contribution not dictated by rules, but by the practical demands of life. She began to understand that value could be experienced in small, everyday acts as well as in grand gestures. One afternoon, a small accident occurred. While gathering water from the stream, Sister Maria slipped on the wet rocks and fell, twisting her ankle. She cried out in surprise and pain, and the mountain man rushed to her side. With careful hands, he helped her to a safe spot, cleaned a small scrape, and supported her back to the cabin. The incident was minor, yet it became a profound lesson for her. She realized that asking for help was not weakness, and that accepting support did not diminish her independence or worth. That evening, sitting near the fire with her ankle resting on a soft cloth, Sister Maria reflected deeply. The mountains, the cabin, and the mountain man had taught her lessons she had never learned in the convent. She understood that life required courage, not only the courage to serve others, but the courage to face oneself, to accept flaws and mistakes, and to pursue what brought fulfillment. She also realized that worth was not given by others' approval, but by recognition of her own value. The mountain man watched her quietly, recognizing the change in her demeanor. He saw her shoulders relax, her eyes brighter, and her voice steadier. He had witnessed countless storms and hardships in his life, but the transformation he saw in her was different. It was a quiet strength, a growing awareness that life could be lived with intention and self-respect. He felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that his presence had helped her along this path, not through force or advice, but through example, patience, and listening. Over the following days, they spoke more freely, discussing ideas, dreams, and possibilities for the future. Sister Maria asked questions about the mountains, about surviving in isolation, and about finding meaning in small acts. The mountain man answered honestly, sharing the lessons that life had taught him, and in turn, he asked her questions that encouraged her to reflect on her desires and values. Their conversations were not rushed, nor did they aim to reach conclusions. They were a dialogue of discovery, a quiet exchange that illuminated the heart and mind. By the time she prepared to leave again for the convent, Sister Maria felt a newfound sense of purpose. She had faced the storm within herself, questioned her assumptions, and begun to embrace the idea that her life could hold meaning beyond service alone. She was not abandoning her path, but she was choosing to live it with awareness, self-respect, and an understanding of her own worth. The mountain man, watching her prepare, felt a sense of quiet pride and reassurance. He had witnessed the transformation of someone who had been burdened by doubt and had helped her find clarity through presence and patience. As she walked down the mountain path, sunlight streaming through the trees, Sister Maria carried with her a sense of calm and determination. She understood that life's challenges would not disappear, but she now possessed the tools to face them with courage, self-respect, and clarity. The mountains, the fire, and the quiet wisdom of the mountain man had given her a gift beyond measure, the knowledge that she mattered, not for what she did, but for who she was. And the mountain man, alone again in the cabin, sat by the fire with a quiet smile. He had been reminded that even in isolation, the presence of another human being could illuminate the soul, challenge assumptions, and inspire growth. The mountains remained silent witnesses, standing tall and eternal. But within the cabin, a profound understanding had taken root, an understanding that life's worth was measured not only by endurance, but by recognition of one's own heart and the courage to live it fully. The days turned into weeks, and the mountains began to wear their usual quiet calm. Sister Maria had returned to the convent, but the time she spent with the mountain man stayed with her like an echo, gentle but persistent. She moved through the halls of the convent with renewed focus, performing her duties with care, yet her heart was different. She no longer acted only out of routine or obligation. Instead, she acted with awareness and purpose. She had begun to understand that helping others was important, but it was equally important to respect herself, her thoughts, and her desires. The other nuns noticed a change in her. She walked with more confidence, spoke with more certainty, and listened with a deeper patience. While she still served as she had always done, there was a balance now. She allowed herself moments of rest without guilt, small times for reflection and personal growth that had previously seemed impossible. She understood that self-respect and service were not opposites. They were part of the same life, each reinforcing the other. Despite her progress, she could not forget the mountain man. His quiet presence, his understanding, and his simple wisdom had left a lasting mark on her heart. She found herself thinking about him during her solitary walks in the convent gardens, remembering the firelight, the storm, and the long conversations that had stretched into the night. She realized that their meeting had been more than coincidence. It had been a turning point, a moment that had challenged her to confront her doubts and fears and to consider life in a new way. One day, she received a letter from the mountain man. He had written carefully, describing the changes in the mountains, the patterns of the seasons, and the small events of life that he found meaningful. There were no words of expectation or obligation, only observations, reflections, and simple truths about living in the world as it is. Reading his words, Sister Maria felt a quiet comfort, a reminder that she was not alone in her thoughts, and that someone who understood solitude and struggle shared the same values she now sought to embrace. The mountains continued to teach lessons even from afar. Sister Maria began to approach her work with renewed clarity, focusing on the people she helped, but also noticing their own struggles and joys. She realized that true service required empathy, not just action, and that valuing others meant understanding the depth of their humanity, not just their needs. In turn, she applied this understanding to herself, acknowledging her own worth, accepting her doubts, and allowing herself to grow beyond the limitations she had imposed in her mind. Time passed, and Sister Maria found new opportunities opening before her. She was encouraged to teach, to lead small groups, and eventually to guide others who were struggling to find balance in their lives. She shared her experiences, not as lessons to follow, but as stories of growth and reflection, hoping to help others recognize their own worth. Her life became richer and fuller not because it was easier, but because she had learned to live intentionally, embracing both the joys and the hardships that life presented. Meanwhile, the mountain man continued his life in the mountains, solitary yet no longer entirely isolated. He reflected on the time he had spent with Sister Maria, realizing that even a brief connection could leave a profound impact on life. He had always valued his independence and solitude, but he now understood that relationships, simple, honest, human connections, could enhance the experience of living rather than diminish it. He found satisfaction in knowing that his presence had helped someone else see their own value, just as her presence had reminded him of the richness of shared understanding. Years passed, and the mountain man maintained a quiet routine in the mountains. Yet every season he would find himself thinking of Sister Maria, wondering about her life and her journey. He knew she had grown stronger, more self-assured, and capable of facing the world with confidence. And he felt a sense of peace, knowing that their encounter had changed both their lives for the better. The mountains, once only a place of survival, had become a place of reflection and connection, a bridge between two people who had learned the quiet power of understanding and empathy. Sister Maria, for her part, never forgot the lessons of the cabin and the fire. She carried them into her work, her interactions, and her personal reflections. She realized that life's worth was not measured in grand gestures or heroic acts alone, but in the consistent, thoughtful engagement with one's own life and the lives of others. She embraced this philosophy fully, teaching, guiding, and helping, but also allowing herself the freedom to rest, reflect, and pursue her own passions. She had learned that balance was not only necessary but liberating, and that understanding her own worth was the foundation for truly meaningful service. One crisp morning, years after that first stormy night, Sister Maria returned once more to the mountains, walking the familiar trails with a heart full of memory and reflection. The cabin had aged, as all things do, yet it still stood firm, a testament to time and endurance. She approached quietly, aware that the mountain man might be nearby, tending his small home, or wandering the trails. As she reached the cabin, she saw him standing outside, looking toward the valley, the same calm and watchful figure she remembered. They greeted each other with quiet smiles, the familiarity of years and the depth of shared experience reflected in their gestures. They spoke for hours, as they had long ago, sharing observations about life, the mountains, and the journey each had undertaken since their first meeting. The mountain man shared the changes he had witnessed, small events and reflections that held meaning in their simplicity. Sister Maria shared her own growth, the lessons she had learned, and the ways in which she had applied them to her life and the lives of others. There was no rush, no expectation, only understanding. They both recognized the unique impact of their connection and the lasting effect it had on their lives. Their bond was quiet, reflective, and enduring, built not on dependency or need, but on respect, honesty, and the shared recognition of human value. It was a relationship that had grown from vulnerability, patience, and reflection, and it remained a source of strength and insight for both of them. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in hues of gold and orange, they stood together outside the cabin, appreciating the silence, the beauty, and the presence of each other. Sister Maria felt a deep gratitude, not only for the mountain man's companionship, but for the lessons the mountains had taught her about life, worth, and courage. She understood that her journey was ongoing, but she carried with her the tools, the wisdom, and the quiet strength to face it fully. The mountain man, watching the sky, felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had spent much of his life in solitude, yet he now recognized that true solitude was not emptiness. It was the opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to form connections that mattered deeply. Sister Maria had reminded him of the value of shared understanding, empathy, and quiet support, and he felt gratitude for the gift of her presence in his life. As night fell, the mountains stood silent, eternal, and unchanging. Yet within the cabin, and within the hearts of those who had shared it, there was warmth, understanding, and a sense of purpose. Sister Maria and the mountain man had found in each other a reflection of human resilience, honesty, and the quiet power of connection. They had faced storms, both literal and metaphorical, and emerged with insight, growth, and respect for life's inherent value. The story of their meeting, the storm, and the conversations by the fire became a memory that guided them in the years to come. It reminded them that even in isolation, even in moments of doubt or fear, there was always the potential for understanding, growth, and meaningful connection. They had learned that human worth was not given or measured by others, but recognized through self-reflection, courage, and the simple presence of someone willing to listen and understand. And so life continued, each following their own path, yet forever linked by the memory of a stormy night, a warm fire, and a quiet understanding that changed the course of both their lives. Sister Maria would carry the lessons forward, teaching, guiding, and living intentionally, while the mountain man would continue to navigate the mountains, strengthened by the knowledge that even in solitude, the impact of human connection could be profound, lasting, and transformative.